Welcome back, everybody. We are going to take a look at a few more terms that relate to missions. And again, I'll try to keep these definitions as succinct and basic as I can, and then we'll keep our eyes open for them as we move through the course. So let's begin with the term national church. Basically, a national church is a church that whose leadership has been formally transferred to the national believers. And what that simply means is there comes a time when the missionary pastor or missionary leader moves on and turns the authority over, hands the keys to the nationals. It's a formal transaction which says you are now in charge. I am stepping out and moving on to something else. Now, that's very similar to the next term that I want to share with you, and sometimes these two are used synonymously. So here you have national church, but next is what we call an indigenous church. This is a church which has become part of its own culture in the way it thinks and acts. Now, the difference between a national church and an indigenous church is very important to keep in mind. The word indigenous literally means of the ground or from the land. And it's the idea that a church should look like and function like uh, the people of its own culture as much as it's able to within biblical bounds. So when a foreign missionary starts a church or a Bible college in a particular country, he or she is obviously going to bring with them the mindset and methodology used in the home culture. And even though you may turn the keys over to national leadership, that national leadership may for a while continue to lead the church just like you did, because that's the way they learned to do it. And so they may continue to hold business meetings like you did and prepare sermons and conduct the church service the same way that you did. So indigeneity is the idea of the people beginning to act and think like the people of their own culture. Just to give you an example, thinking about business meetings, in the Western world, business meetings are very commonly used. Majority vote wins the day. But in some cultures, especially indigenous, I'm sorry, tribal-oriented cultures, where individualism is not as big of a deal, business meetings may not work because consensus or even the opinion of the leaders of the tribe takes precedence over mere percentages. So you may have a vote of 51 to 49 and say, okay, well, then the vote passes. But if one of those who voted in the 49% happens to be a key leader in the church, the people will be confused if you allow that vote to pass. That's a very complex subject. But again, it just illustrates the idea that different types of leadership in different types of cultures may make the way that we do church business different from what the missionaries have been accustomed to doing. So, a lot about that we could share. And again, cultural anthropology deals with some of those issues. What about multi-ethnic church? Well, a multi-ethnic church is a church composed of believers from various ethnic backgrounds. This is quite an interesting discussion. If you're starting a church in a neighborhood or a city that is dominated by one ethnicity, this will not be an issue. But suppose you're in an inner city work downtown somewhere and you have a variety, maybe 4, 5, 6 different ethnicities in the same downtown area. Do you start one church and invite all of them to be a part? Or do you start different churches, one for each ethnicity? Well, the answer is not as easy as it may seem at first glance. You could say, well, when Paul went to Corinth or Ephesus or other places, he didn't start a Jewish church and then a Gentile church in the same location. He started one church where Jews and Gentiles met together, and that is true. That is not to say that it is never appropriate to have different churches for different ethnicities. The biggest factor in favor of doing that would be the language issue. If you have different ethnicities who speak different languages and there is not one common language that binds them together, it may be very difficult to insist that all of them meet together in the same location. Again, that's a subject that also attracts a lot of attention and a good one to consider for future study. Majority world. What is a majority world? Well, the majority world is non-Western nations, also known as two-thirds world and formerly known as third world countries. just a quick explanation here. The designations First World, Second World, and Third World were primarily economic designations. They had to do with countries in the First World case who had enough money to support themselves and others. Second World countries could support themselves but didn't have much left over to help other nations. And Third World countries were those that weren't even able to support themselves and had to depend on help from other nations. That is a designation we choose not to use in the missions world today because we're not so much concerned with the economic situations of worlds as we are with the cultural differences and population differences. So today we divide the world up, thinking of missions, in primarily two groups. The West, which is North America and Western Europe, and then the rest of the world, which is the 2/3 or majority world. And that's because 2/3 of the population of the Earth is non-Western. And so again, these are arbitrary ways of dividing up the population of the world, but majority world is the 2/3 world, which would be everybody except North America and Western Europe. All right, majority world. What is a mobilizer? Well, a mobilizer refers to a person or organization which actively seeks to involve others in the mission's endeavor. So you may not be a missionary on the front line. You may be somebody back in the home office of a mission agency who is promoting missions and maybe visiting colleges or churches and trying to encourage people to consider giving their lives to serve as missionaries. So mobilizers help to engage people in thinking about missions and even considering becoming missionaries themselves. And actually, it is important to keep in mind that in a certain sense, everybody should be a mobilizer. In other words, we should all be thinking about the Great Commission, and whether you're a pastor in a church or a Sunday school teacher or a foreign missionary or a home missionary, in some sense, you should help people to be conscious of the global need for the gospel. And in that sense, you're serving as a mobilizer. But there are people who are actually on paid staff positions where they do that as a full-time job. That's what a mobilizer does. Short-term mission, that's a big one. It's a temporary investment of time and ministry on a mission field. Now, short-term missions can be anything from a week-long missions trip someplace all the way to a career missionary experience. In fact, here at Faith, just this past year, we took a couple of trips to an inner city ministry over a weekend. We left on Friday after lunch and got back Sunday night. That was a short-term trip, very short, but also very impactful. Normally, mission agencies will consider a missionary endeavor to be short-term up to a year or two. If they decide to go beyond that, then they would fall more into the category of a career missionary. Our short-term missions trips viable? Are they a good idea? Well, that just depends. There are some short-term missions trips that have been done in a way that really calls into question whether they're legitimate. They're a little more than a glorified tourism experience or vacation or something like that. What makes a short-term trip legitimate? Well, there has to be some sort of ministry involvement, ministry engagement, whether it's being exposed to ministry or being actually involved in doing ministry or some sort of combination. That needs to be taken into consideration. So I encourage anyone who has an opportunity to be exposed to missions through a short-term experience to take advantage if God should open that door. People group. What is a people group? Well, it's a group of people which share the same ethnic and linguistic traits. Now, there are lots of different ways that people identify people groups, all right? For example, some would say that they're defined primarily by language, and language would probably be the number one consideration. But other people add geography, even if they speak the same language, but they live in different geographic locations. For example, you may have people living in the mountains and others down in the plains or the valleys. And even though they speak the same language, the way of life is very different. So we could call them two different people groups. You can go on a website online of your choice and just type in people groups and you'll see all sorts of definitions. I would recommend to you the Joshua Project. If you type that in the search engine, they have some very, very helpful tools to assist you in understanding how people define what a people group is. Some will include religion, some will include even political systems, skin color, just a lot of things that enter into the equation. And if you check out the Joshua Project, I think you'll find some very helpful information. Spiritual warfare is a big one. What is spiritual warfare? Well, it's defined in a lot of different ways, but I like this one. It's the conflict between demonic spiritual forces and believers who attempt to establish the gospel message around the world. We are in a spiritual battle. Remember, Paul said in Ephesians 6, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, rulers of the darkness of this world, spiritual wickedness in the heavenly places. Satan and his army is definitely attacking the Church of Jesus Christ. And whether you feel that up close and personal or not, the fact is that conflict does exist. Now, I'm just going to tell you that there are some groups out there that have really, in my opinion, abused this a little bit and said, hey, we need to engage in power encounters where, we see visible displays of God's power that wow people and help them to see that the God of the Bible is God. And I think you need to be really careful about that. Some will use the book of Acts to justify that. And if you take Acts with me or with somebody else, you'll find, I think, that even though those types of things do happen in the book of Acts, they are not signs and wonders that are expected to be normative throughout the duration of the church age. Again, that's a subject that deserves much more time, and we could get to that later on. Reentry. Wow. Reentry is the process of readjusting to one's home culture after having spent significant time in a host culture. So just as a missionary goes to a foreign field, in the case of going to a foreign field, because not all do, obviously, there are home missionaries, but a missionary that goes to a foreign field will experience what we call culture shock and has to adjust to that. After a significant amount of time on that field, he or she may come home and discover that the adjustment is just as serious and just as challenging coming back after being away for so many years. I experienced that after my first 4 years in Brazil. I came back to the States. People were different, churches were different, society had moved on, and I suddenly realized that I wasn't the same person that I was when I left, and America wasn't the same America that I left. So re-entry is a real deal. It's partnership. Partnership is cooperation of believers in different cultures as a way of sharing the responsibility of spreading the gospel of Christ. Partnership can take place between missionaries and nationals. They can take place between missionaries on the same field. It can also involve the partnership between a missionary and his or her sending church, or his or her agency, if that missionary is cooperating with a mission agency. All right. So that gives you a few terms to deal with. And again, I threw a lot at you in 2 sessions, and I don't do that to confuse you or to give you a brain drain. I do that because these are all terms that will come back again as we study. Maybe go over those again and kind of review those terms in your notes. And I hope that they will be of help to you as we move forward in our study. All right, we'll see you next time.